okay, I don't see one right now, but some of them were actually written from prison camp, and of course have all the German printing on the front. So without further ado, I'm going to start with this little book called My Life in the Service and just show you a couple of what I think are really cute things in here. And here's a list of my buddies. So my Army Air Force buddies, and these would have been guys that Dad met in training over those various locations in the West. None of his fellow crew members that joined up with him in the B-17 are listed in here, but I thought it was really cute, and think most of these guys were probably 18 to 22 years old. But I love the fact, if any of you have ever watched war movies, you notice a lot of people always get nicknames. And I was always like, did they make that up? I mean, was that really their nickname, you know? And of course, the guy with the red hair is always Red, you know? But it was always the different characters in these war movies. There had to be a couple of guys with funny or silly or kind of crazy nicknames. Well, I found out from looking in here, nobody was making that up. So the very first guy listed in here is Delbert A., and it looks like Betcher, and it says he's from West Louisville, Kentucky, and right under that he puts, and you can very clearly see it, I'll just show you the top one, the Kentucky Colonel. So he had either nicknamed himself or family had nicknamed him Kentucky Colonel. The one below that says Harry Bennett, and it says a member in good standing of the fox hunting fools. A member in good standing of the fox hunting fools. Wouldn't we all like to know what that was? I'm kind of guessing maybe they did hunt foxes, but maybe again, maybe not. Maybe that was girls. I don't know. Here's another one right below that. Paul Biggert, Valparaiso, Indiana. The Hoosier Hotshot. The Hoosier Hotshot. Don't you just love it? So I'm looking at all these guys that Dad knew in the service, and I was amazed how many of them had nicknames. Here's one of my favorites, Mike Nielsen from Yonkers, New York. And in parentheses to the side of that, he says, remember the latrine details I put you on. So right there, he says, remember, I know it's reversed, but remember the latrine details I put you on. Hi, Ray. Thanks for joining. So I'm just sharing a little bit out of Dad's journal. And my favorite part of this whole journal, there's a lot of blank pages, but there's a lot of stuff filled out. Different days here, almost like a diary, you know, a journal. He does better on that than I did. But he went through there and he talked about what was going on in each day, that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my favorite time is getting here on January 17th, 1942. He says, I went back to camp and I transferred, and Ray, maybe you can help me later on this. It looks like from 2nd S.S, so SS, to 22nd something, shipping and receiving. So shipping and receiving. So that makes sense, you know, unloading the trucks, putting the inventory up for the quartermaster or whatever. But then it starts to get funny. Hi, Teresa. Welcome. January 18th, it said, I had KP first time since I have been in the Army. So he's been in the Army, I guess now, about 10 months, and he hasn't had KP until this point. So he says, January 18th, had KP. It gets better. January 19th, KP again. Got off for a dental appointment, went before AG board, I think that's Adjutant General, accepted, went into town, so maybe he had to go before the AG to make sure he could get off for his dental appointment, went into town to see Bert. The town he's referring to is Las Vegas, Nevada. Imagine Las Vegas, Nevada in 1942. You know, be a cow town, wouldn't it? And then he had said he has supper at Elizabeth. I have no idea. I've never heard about whether this is a gal, whether this is a relative. But once again, January 21st, KP again. Don't you love it? And then January 23rd, 1942, 11 years to the day that I was born, 11 years after, obviously, I was born, KP again. And then he says, when I came back, I was in shipping. So I think he's pretty disgusted at that point, and I found that really funny that he had it up to here with KP. So enough with the KP, but that's fun, and a lot of my dad's great memories of wonderful friends that he made during training before he went to Europe. But as you know, we skipped over to Europe last night, and we're over there now. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about his missions. And I made too many notes, and I won't try to confuse you, but I want to tell you about a wonderful website. I'm sorry I scratched that all up, but I want to tell you about a wonderful website. And I know Ray, you'll get into this, and maybe a couple others will, you'll glance at it when you got a minute. But it's just called 388 BG, and that's all it is. It's just 388bg.com. Hi, Jeff Burrier. Hi, Stephanie, for joining us. Jeff, thanks for all you're doing. Jeff's a doctor there in Newcomerstown, and I know that's a even more stressful than usual job right now. So thanks, Jeff. But a lot of documents like this can be seen on the 388bg.com, and that was the bomb group that Dad was in out of Kettishall. I'm sorry I pronounced it wrong last night. Out of Kettishall, 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 England. And so this listed the missions, but I tried to put a few notes on each one. I won't bore you with all those details right now, but I will tell you that it's a little confusing because according to the 388th Bomb Group website, which is an extremely well-done website, gosh, I don't know how they did it, Dad flew 9 missions. Dad says he only flew 7, but Dad shows one they don't show, and it was his very first mission, and I find it hard to believe anyone would forget the date and time and what happened on their very first mission, because I would think you'd have been scared to death. And he lists a mission before what they have down as his first mission. So I believe with every confidence he was actually on 10 missions, but remember, he was putting this together when he was in his 70s, and so it was 50 years before, so I'm confident that it was very easy to maybe not remember a couple of those missions after that long. Okay, so what we're going to talk about right now is the missions that he was on, and I'm going to show you a picture of what he looked like around that time, and that's a really good photo, isn't it? I really like that one. So I think that was taken the same day as the one with his mother and father, and I think that's in the backyard, I think on Miller Avenue in Denison. So I think that's where that was taken. His first mission, we'll start right there. Our first mission on July 29th, 1943, was the 6th mission of the 388th. So the 388th out of Kettishall had only flown 5 other missions before Cunningham's crew, Dad's crew, got there. So they were there really early on. And as we flew over France, he says, there was a lot of flak. The Germans wouldn't attack as long as we had P-47 escorts, which of course are American fighter planes. But they could not go as deep into enemy territory as the bombers, meaning they had smaller fuel tanks. They couldn't carry as much fuel. They had to turn around sooner. The bombers had much larger capacity. And during the first mission, we lost one plane when it collided with another plane. And so I looked that up on the 388th website, and it's called Warrenmundy, 6th mission of the 388th Warrenmundy, and it was the Henkel Aircraft Factory, and one of the things they made in that factory, they say FW-190, and what that is a Focke-Wulf 190 German fighter plane. And if you recall last night, I said the #1 nemesis of the American bomber, of course, was the German fighter plane, and that was the Focke-Wulf 190 and the 109 Messerschmitt. So those 2 planes. So if they could do anything to take those planes out and blow up a factory that manufactured those planes, then that meant clearer skies for the bombers. And keep in mind, this is all July 29th, 1943. This is 11 months before D-Day. So we're trying to soften things up before the land invasion, right? So, you know, I know you all know that, but think about it in your history books. We got to soften the target up before we can bring our land troops in. Our second mission was to bond Germany, and the 388th actually lists that one as his first trip, on August 13th, 1943, and he says we had to turn back because we had a broken oxygen line, which was essential. So let's think about an oxygen line, and those of you that didn't join us last night, just to clarify, a B-17 was a depressurized vehicle, and the number one reason for that was flak was being shot up from the ground, and of course planes were shooting at you, and of course those bullets would go through the hull, or the fuselage, I guess we want to say, of the aircraft. So think about a pressurized aircraft if it had holes in it. So they couldn't be pressurized. So the temperature was at least 20 below zero at 20,000 feet in the air. And if somebody wants to call me, I could be a hair off on that, but I think I'm pretty close. And the point of that is that you have to turn back because everybody's got an oxygen line where they're breathing oxygen through a mask. And that mask, excuse me one second, that mask attached to this kind of a skull cap gizmo. I don't have him on my my guy very good, and I would put it on my head, but it's a small, and my head is not small. It does not fit. But you can see where the snap-ons here are, and this is actually an Army Air Force issue. Now, I'm not going to say this one was in the war. It might have come from an Army surplus store, but it was not Dad's personal one. His head wasn't that small either. But this is where it snapped on. So the oxygen mask would go over here. So if you, if you lost your oxygen, you were going to pass out, and a lot of guys did. And so a lot of guys were passed out when they landed. But what you had to do, if one of those oxygen lines broke for one of those 10 guys, you had to turn around and come back. So that mission for your plane, not the whole group, but for your one plane, was, as they call it, and I don't like the word, but it was aborted, and that's the term that they use. So that was the second raid. The third raid, and Dad does not have this down, but it's listed as a 388th, and it's listed as the Cunningham crew, and Dad's listed as a part of this crew on this flight. And their third flight was to Merville Airfield in Merville, France, and that was to attack both the airfield and a fuel dump. So obviously, German fighter pilots were flying out of there. They were refueling there and taking back off to attack American bombers. So that's why you'd want to take a fuel dump out, and also an airfield. Why not wipe the airfield out while you're there? And then the fourth mission, which also does not show up on Dad's list, is a place called Pox Abbeville, and there were airfields there as well. So they're bombing a lot of airfields, and Dale, thank you for being on. So I'm going to read the rest of it as Dad says it, but I believe his third flight was probably actually his fourth or fifth flight. But this is certainly one of the most memorable flights, and this is a very famous mission in Army Air Force and Air Force in general history. It's called the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, and there were two missions to Schweinfurt, one later in the war after Dad was shot down, and the reason they were attacking there was they were making the Messerschmitt fighter plane in those two locations, in those two factories. So it was felt that if the 8th Air Force could get these bombers in deep into German territory and take these Messerschmitt factories out, that would allow the bombers to dominate the air. Okay? Makes sense? So this is what Dad's calling his third flight in the book, but I believe it's his fourth or fifth. This is August 17th. I do want to share with you that his first flight he lists as July 29th, and we know he was shot down September 6, 1943. All the training, all the time that he was there totaled close to 4 years between the training and the flying in the war and being in the POW camp. But think about it, all the flying took place between July 29th and September 6th. So a little over a month, only about 5 weeks, they flew these 10 missions. And I'm sure guys were probably ready to crack up just from all the stress. So on our third flight on August 17th, it was quite different than our first 2 flights. We were called out at 3 a.m. and instructed to just take a change of clothes. We could not imagine where we were going, but we knew that a B-17 could not hold enough fuel to reach Russia. And of course, the only way you'd want to reach Russia is because they were an ally at that time. You could land safely and perhaps refuel. But he said even the enlisted guys knew they didn't have enough fuel to get to Russia, so they didn't know where they were going. So during the pre-flight, after they're all on board, all they told us was to taxi to the end of the runway and take off. He says we took formation over the English Channel and were only permitted to abort the mission if we lost an engine. He doesn't say anything about a loss of oxygen, so I'm almost guessing if one guy passes out from loss of oxygen, they're going to keep going. I don't know, but that's the way it reads. After we were in the air, the pilot told us we were going to Regensburg, Germany, just south of Berlin. So what's more than the heart of Nazi Germany than Berlin? And they're going to Regensburg, Germany, just south of Berlin. And it's to that point the deepest the 8th Air Force had ever been. And it's their 11th mission. So it's the 11th mission of the 388th. I don't know what mission it is for the 8th Air Force because there was a lot more than just the 388th in the 8th Air Force. But it was as deep as the 8th Air Force had ever gone into enemy territory. As soon as we hit the target, we would travel south to Africa, a trip longer than any B-17s had ever made. So B-17s hadn't gone that far, and I don't know what the air miles is on that. I was going to get a map out and show you, but we all know in our heads from Kenishall, England, across the English Channel to just south of Berlin to Africa is a long way. We were in the air for 11 hours and on alert at all times, mean be ready. There could be fighters, just coming up on us at any time. We met German fighters midway after our P-47 escort had to go back to England, which we talked about before. They didn't have enough fuel to follow them the whole way. There were dogfights all the way, and we lost our right wing plane. So the plane on their immediate right was lost. It went down. The tail gunner on their crew, on Dad's crew, got credit for a Focke-Wulf. So we think about the old Snoopy versus the Red Baron. We understand what getting credit for a plane is. It meant that the tail gunner on the In God We Trust, Dad's plane, shot down a Focke-Wulf German fighter plane. Okay? We hit the target and did some serious damage. Our unit later received a commendation for the raid on Regensburg. After hitting the target, we turned south over the Alps. There were no fighters because the Germans expected us to go back to England. So instead of going back to England, they go south over the Alps, over Italy, across the Mediterranean. Over the Mediterranean Sea, we went down low and broke formation to save fuel. So now it's what do you want to say? It's a battle against time. Will they land in Africa before they run out of fuel? That's the whole idea. He said, the planes on our right started shooting. And Dad's thinking, why are they shooting? He's looking out in front and he can't see anything. And he says, we could not see enemy planes, so we didn't understand. But the co-pilot reported we were low on fuel and needed to throw all unnecessary baggage and loose items overboard. I think the guy in the other plane was shooting, sounds crazy, to get rid of the bullets. You would have thought they could have just taken the cartridges and canisters of bullets and just thrown them over the side. And as I mentioned last night, I don't know that they opened the bomb bay doors to do that because they had where the waist gunners were on either side of the plane were wide open so they could dump anything out through there. So here's what he says that they threw out. We threw out machine guns, walkways, which would be the walkways across the bomb bay, and other loose objects into the sea, keeping only our water. We lost 8 planes in the Mediterranean Sea, but Dad says later, but no men were lost because PB-4 seaplanes. So he gives a specific seaplane. I don't know what that one looks like. But PB-4 seaplanes met up with those guys that were down and rescued them. So they didn't lose any guys in the Mediterranean Ocean, even though they lost a number of planes. One plane even lost a vertical stabilizer because it was hit by another plane during landing. After having spent 11 hours in the air, I stretched out under one of the wings and fell asleep in spite of the African heat. We spent a few days in North Africa, and some of the men and I traveled to Constantine. I need to look that up and see where it's at. Maybe some of you know what country that's in today. It might go by another name than it did in 1943, where we had lunch and watched an area funeral, I guess because it was, something to do. So that's the third mission. That's Regensburg. It's the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. It's pretty famous. It's a huge, huge operation, and book after book after book have been written about that. It was not completely successful. Our fourth mission was on the way back to England from Africa. So think about it. What's the phrase? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So they've got another mission on the way back to England from Africa where we bombed southern France. And that was in Bordeaux. Yes, the famous name that matches the wine in Bordeaux. And I made a note on that. And they bombed hangars and airfields in Bordeaux. So hangars, again, probably German fighter planes, and of course airfields, so they couldn't get them out. They'd have to rebuild the airfields, which would take time. He said, while over France, we lost one engine and could not feather it. I didn't know what feather meant for a long time. I had to Google it a number of years ago. Feather, it meant they couldn't stop it. So the propeller would just continue like this, even though the motor wasn't running because of the oncoming wind. And if it feathered long enough, it would fall off. And evidently that was a really bad thing. We were on the deck off the coast of France, meaning we're coming in low, right? Off the coast of France, and we're concerned we would have to bail out of the plane. We did reach England safely, and we landed at the British Air Force Airport. I have something here that I want to share. And I found this as a newspaper clipping in a stack of newspaper clippings. Dad's sister Lucille kept a lot of this stuff and then gave it back to Dad after the war. His mother was very ill during this time, and so most of the letters were sent to his sister Lucille. But I'm going to read this part here. This is actually after he was shot down, but part of it takes place before. It says he had flown from Africa, helping scuttle ships evacuate Germans there. I'm not sure what that means. His plane had its landing gear shot away and made a belly landing. He does not reference that anywhere, but it's in this newspaper article, which I assume is either the Denison or Uriksville newspaper, back at that time. But here's my favorite part. He says, on a return trip to England, they carried an African burro as a mascot. Now, he does not mention that, as you just saw or heard in the book that I read, because they've just come back from Africa and landed in England at a British airport, but no word there about the fact that on a return trip to England, they carried an African burro as a mascot. So I'm sure the commanding officer of the base was really excited when the In God We Trust brought back an African burro. But I've never seen pictures. Dad never mentioned it, but it's in this newspaper piece about it. So I'm guessing that, someone got the information to him and it was correct. So we'll move on. So now we're at that British airport, not the one they're supposed to be at, but the first one they could find to land. And the British were able to fix our plane and we returned to our base, that would be Kennesaw, only 1 day late. We were given a 3-day leave to London. Now, remember I was talking about that country boy, never been out of Denison or Jewett or Tippecanoe, and now in the last year, you know, he's been to Casper, Wyoming, and Las Vegas, Nevada, and all these places out west. He's been to Syracuse, New York, and now he's got a 3-day pass to London. Are you kidding me? So I didn't hear any stories about that. He didn't share them, but I'm sure they were in the back of his mind someplace. When they got back to the base, Tech Sergeant Land, who was a member of their crew, one of the 10 guys on their crew, said that was enough. He'd had enough. He wasn't going up again. And the pilot was not happy about this. And when he says the pilot, he's talking about Lieutenant Dick Cunningham, his pilot. Said the pilot was not happy about this, and he asked the waist gunner to take over the top turret, which had been Land's assignment. Sergeant Brokert, which was the waist gunner, or one of the waist gunners at that time, Dad was also a waist gunner at that time, did not want the job. He says, I don't want the top turret. So I asked if it meant another stripe. Now, do y'all remember what I said last night? I said, another stripe, more money, I'm up for it. So here's another stripe. And the pilot said it did. And since I had some experience training in the top turret, I was given the job. So that now puts him in the top turret. And I'm going to show those of you that maybe didn't join us last night where that is. And I'll just quickly go back over the positions that I showed you last night. Tail gunner got credit for a Focke-Wulf. He's shooting from back here. Belly turret or ball turret here clear on the bottom. Little guys only fit there. Waist gunners on both sides. This is your radio antenna. Your radio man is down inside here. In the front, your pilot and co-pilot and your bombardier and your navigator all up here in the nose, and Dad's up here in this top turret up here, also called engineer. Okay? So that's a little bit of that. Now we're on their 5th mission. On the 5th mission, it was to Brussels to destroy an airfield, but we had to abort before arrival when the first gunner passed out for lack of oxygen. So again, another oxygen loss, another abort, and they had to go back. Our 6th mission was to attack the Moulins-les-Morose airfield, and 19 planes bombed with very little flak, meaning flak is that shrapnel and bullets coming up from the ground from those huge guns that the Germans had. Very little flak and very few fighters, so that's a good thing. We had fighter protection the whole way, so because it was a shorter flight, the P-47s could go in with them, and so it was a short flight. Here's a photo that I took on a flight that Dad and I took in 2013 on the Yankee Lady. I don't think I showed this the other night. And this is a photo of the nose of the B-17 Yankee Lady. It's one of like only 10 operational B-17s left in the world, and I think all of them are in the United States. And of course the Memphis Belle has just been redone, and she is at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, but they're not going to fly her. She's a beautiful piece, and they spent 10 years to get her back in perfect condition. So she'll be at the Dayton Wright-Patt Air Force Base probably, you know, forever now. But anyway, here's a photo I took inside the nose, because Dad and I got to fly on that B-17 over Port Clinton. And that seat that you see there is the bombardier seat, and that object, that mechanical object in front of it's what's called a Norden bomb sight. And so that's where the bombardier of a B-17 sat when he sighted in through that Norden bomb sight the target below. And so you can see that he saw everything, but of course not a very good place to be either, because any fighter jets coming in, you know, you're the first thing they're going to see, or probably the first thing they're going to hit. Okay? So that's the 5th mission. And the 6th mission, I'm sorry, that's the 5th and the 6th. And now it's the 7th according to Dad, but I'm fairly confident that it might be the 9th or even the 10th, and he just didn't recall them all. But it is the final mission, and the final mission was September 6th, 1943, we took off on what began as a normal flight over Germany, and as he says, our 7th mission. We hit the target at about noon, and he calls it a VKF, which I assume is a brand. I have not looked that up, but it's a ball bearing plant in Stuttgart, Germany. And if you didn't hear me say that last night, a ball bearing plant was essential to the war effort at any level. Fighter aircraft, howitzers, tanks, jeeps. I mean, what can't you think of that's mechanical that probably doesn't have ball bearings in it someplace? So blow up a ball bearing plant and take out their ability to build a lot of different pieces of war machinery. Let's say it that way. Thanks for joining us, Warren. So we hit the target at about noon, the VKF ball bearing plant in Stuttgart, and we dealt with the usual flak without too many fighters challenging us on the way home. Over France, now they're on the way back, the pilot told us to look outside the plane, and I looked out to see somewhere between 150 and 200 B-17s in all directions. So they're gathering back, they're crossing the English Channel after the successful bombing of the VKF ball bearing plant in Stuttgart, and he said we were only 6 minutes from a P-47 escort. So in 6 minutes, they're close enough in mainland France to get support from P-47 Mustang fighter planes that would be flying out of England to protect them. So, this is all happening by radio transmission, and the pilot says, hey, we're only 6 minutes from P-47 escort, and we feel much safer once we get those P-47 escorts. Unfortunately, that's when it all came tumbling down. He says, I assumed it would be a normal end to a normal flight. Suddenly, the bombardiers called out that fighters were coming in from the front, 12 o'clock high. You've heard that phrase before. There was a famous movie I mentioned last night with Gregory Peck called 12 o'clock high, and it is what it says it is. If you're in the center of the clock, you look straight up in front of you, 12 o'clock high. That's where they're coming from, right down on top of them. And he said, plane after plane, both Focke-Wulfs and 109 Messerschmitts swept by us 3 or 4 at a time, barrel rolling and shooting the whole time. Now, have you seen that in a movie? Have you watched something like that in a movie and you thought, wow, Top Gun or whatever, and thinking about it, barrel rolling and shooting the whole time, and we return fire? I mean, it really does sound like something out of a movie, but that's why movies get made, because these things really happen. In all, there were nearly 150 German fighters, the largest opposition encountered to date. They had one goal, folks, and one goal only. Disable a fortress, meaning a B-17, otherwise known as a flying fortress, force it out of formation, and destroy it. And think about that. What does the lion do with the water buffalo? What does one animal do to an entire herd? Disable one, force it out of formation with the rest of the group, and destroy it individually. He says, I watched one B-17 go down ahead of us and another B-17 go down to the left of us. The co-pilot yelled out to the crew that we had to bail because we had been hit. I quickly looked over to Lieutenant Cunningham. Now remember, he's in that top turret, so he can actually stick his head out of that turret and look down. The pilot and co-pilot are right there. And he says, I quickly looked over to Lieutenant Cunningham, and he pulled his hands back from the yoke, back from the controls, to show that he had no control of the plane. I rushed to pick up my parachute, hook it on, and then his job at top turret was to run back and tell everybody else. And they may have lost any ability to communicate internally at that time. That may have been shot out too, I'm not sure. But he says, I rushed back to pick up my parachute, hook it on, ran through the bomb bay to the radio room, where the radio man was still firing. In other words, he's still firing a gun. I pulled the ball turret gunner out. That's the guy down below. Watch Memphis Belle. That's Sean Astin. He gets stuck in there one time as they're about to land, and that's a dramatic moment. So he's pulling that guy out of the ball turret, And he says, and then went through the waist door after the rest of the crew. It was all over in just a few moments. And you can think in your mind, you know, it might have taken 4 minutes, but it probably happened in what you thought was a matter of seconds. Thanks for joining us, Dave and Janet. I leapt from the plane and opened my parachute. I looked up to watch as it opened above me and noticed a few holes in the nylon fabric, which I assumed were there because it had been shot through before I strapped it on. So any fighter jets or any flak coming through that plane, parachutes laying, you know, on the floor close to you where you can get it, but you don't have it strapped on while you're in the plane. You only need it if you've got to leave the plane. And he said it's got some holes in it. So he says it was a chest pack rather than the big one that goes on your back, which was much smaller than a backpack. So I had to hold my trust in something much smaller than myself. Now, I think Dad said he had parachuted out of a plane 2, maybe 3 times. And of course, when he did it the first few times, there was no unfriendly fire, and there was no reason to leave a perfectly good plane other than to learn how to do this, you know, when you get into a real-life situation. He says there was no sensation of falling until I hit the clouds. Then I actually realized how fast I was descending. He says, my whole life flashed before me as I neared the ground. I had never prayed to God before, but I prayed right then as I watched the French countryside coming much closer. I worried, thinking about what would happen to me, knowing that the Germans occupied France. I was traveling too fast and landed too hard. I heard my right foot crack upon landing on the ground in a French vineyard. I struggled to stand up, but the shooting pain in my ankle, was just too much. Eventually, I managed to rise to my feet long enough to pull the chute off my chest. I sat down between the vines as my foot began to swell. I had flight boots on, so the ankle could continue to swell and I would still be able to keep them on. A Frenchman ran out to me, motioning for me to come into his house. It hurt too much to walk, so I tried crawling for a distance, but I could not make it. I knew that if the man were caught helping me, as we had been told, he would be shot by the Germans. So I motioned for him to leave. I spent that night in the vineyard. That's where we're going to leave you tonight. Bit of a cliffhanger. And we'll pick up on Thursday night with what happens after that point. And, of course, eventually he's going to end up in a German prison camp. I don't think that's a secret. But I wanted to share in that book, To Kingdom Come, I had printed off a couple of pages of that book when I read it, just so I wouldn't forget where it was, because I don't like to mark books up. But anyway, that's me. But I circled a few things, and in the book To Kingdom Come that I mentioned, very well written, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this, and this is the day that they took off for the Stuttgart raid. I'll just read a little bit, because it's exciting when you're reading a book about World War II, and you see the name of your plane, or your dad's plane in there, or the name of your dad's pilot, and they always refer to the plane as either Cunningham's crew or the In God We Trust. So I'm reading this. Demetrius, the Greek Karzanus, came next and slightly dangerous too. After the 8 bombers of the High Squadron were up, so this is just as they're taking off, after the 8 bombers in the High Squadron are up, it was the Low Squadron's turn. Al Kramer led the way in the Lone Wolf. After Kramer's bomber clawed its way skyward to join the other 2 squadrons, Ted Wilkins shoved the throttles forward in Patricia, and the B-17 began lumbering down the strip, followed by Dick Cunningham in the In God We Trust, Lou Miller in an unnamed plane, James Rowe in Silver Dollar, and Mike Bowen in Sky Shy. So it was 5:40 in the morning. So just seeing the name of Lieutenant Cunningham and Dad's crew and thinking about, that's him. You know, he's inside that plane. So that's them taking off. And then this was probably the most gut-wrenching part that I read in the book. And, you know, I wasn't expecting to see or names named or anything like that. But it says, this is as as this mission is taking place and as men are being shot down by German fighters, and it says, I'll jump down here. It said Lou Miller, who had been leading the 2nd Element of Low Squadron, and that's where Dad's plane was in a Low Squadron, was shot down next. He was halfway through his 25 mission combat tour, so I guess he was number 12 or number 13. You get 25 missions, you get to go home. That's how the Memphis Belle got to go home. He was halfway through his 25 mission combat tour. Lou was from Colorado Springs, and he loved the high country. The plane had absorbed several direct hits in the frontal attacks. Everyone up front, including the co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier, were dead or dying. Now, this is not Dad's plane, but it's a plane in the same group as his in this low squadron coming back from Stuttgart. Everyone up front, I said, was dead or dying. 4 chutes emerged from the back of the plane as it went into a steep dive. Think of that. 4 chutes came out. There's 10 men on that plane. Lou would never see the high country again. The last 3 fortresses, and this is what gives me the willies just reading it. The last 3 fortresses in the low squadron are Lone Wolf, Patricia, and In God We Trust, are still holding together when In God We Trust began falling away. After losing an engine, Dick Cunningham's bomber became easy prey for the swarming fighters. So this is the moment when my dad gets shot out of the sky. And it's just pretty overwhelming. It's on page 130 of this book. And I think I just sat there in shock. I was in Florida at the time reading the book a year ago, and I just had to go walk away for a few minutes and get my composure. At the top turret of Patricia, Joe Schwarzkopf was firing at a fighter coming in from 1 o'clock high. After it passed below them, he swung the turret around and saw that Cunningham's plane was missing. He reported the news to Ted Wilkin. Al Kramer, the lanky, easygoing pilot from New York, had led the low squadron all the way across France and Germany. Since leaving Strasbourg, Germany, Lone Wolf had sustained heavy damage from machine gun and cannon rounds. They had just crossed into French airspace when one of the enemy fighters delivered the coup de grace, shooting out his cockpit instruments and setting the nose compartment on fire. While desperately trying to keep the fortress from going into a flat spin, Kramer ordered his crew to bail out. So these are the planes all around the plane that Dad was in. Warren Laws saw Lone Wolf plunge over in a steep dive. Several men emerged from the hatches of the plane and immediately pulled the ripcords of their parachutes. As the crew members slowly descended earthward, one of the ME-109, that means Messerschmitt 109 pilots, flew toward the parachutes, firing his machine guns at the descending men. Patricia was the last plane left in the squadron, and that's the 563rd. That's Dad's squadron. And they eventually took the Patricia down. The entire 563rd squadron that Dad was in was lost that day. Several of the men survived and were POWs, and we'll tell that story tomorrow night. So, or not tomorrow night, night after, I keep saying. So thank you all for joining. I'll post this. It'll be available on Facebook if you missed the first part, or if you want to watch it with a friend. Thank you all for joining me. And when we come back on Thursday at 7, we're going to talk about his capture, then the first prison camp in Munich, and then the 40 or 8 train cars. And that'll be on Thursday night. So hope to see you then. And thanks for joining me. And folks, stay safe out there. And if you're supposed to stay home, stay home. Terry and I are, in one of those groups being the grocers. And it's been an incredible time for us. And I just want to thank all the customers who have been so understanding and so great. We've had customers buying pizza for our employees. We've had customers bringing us over 40 and 50 bag lunches for our employees at different stores. It's a time like no other that I've seen in my over 50 years in the grocery business. And so we thank everybody for their support. And whoever your local grocer is, be sure to thank them. They're all out there working hard, trying hard to get everything in you need and want, and keeping the shelves stocked. So stay safe out there, everybody. Love you, and see you Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Bye-bye.